This is the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast with your host, Kevin Murray.
Welcome to the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast. On this episode, I'm excited to welcome one of the brightest minds in fantasy sports from Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. It's Matthew Freedman. Welcome to the show, my man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey, I got to meet you in person at the Fantasy Football Expo a few years back, so I'm thrilled to have you on here. You know, this show it's about celebrating the fantasy experience really on every level. I found that, you know, for those that play fantasy sports, you know, they want to learn more about their favorite analysts. So it's, you know, again, it's nice to have you on here. They want to know the behind the scenes, but they also want to, you know more about the resources in fantasy. Obviously, with Fantasy Life, there's a lot you guys are doing, which is great. And then again, a lot of people from the fantasy community really just want to find some inspiration. So they love the origin stories and hearing about people's journey to get a little inspiration to kind of dive deeper into content creation. So obviously, fantasy diehards are thrilled to have you on here. Let's start with, you know, what are you doing currently with Fantasy Life right now?
So, just a lot of fantasy content. You know, I have my Freedman's Favorites articles. I write them every Tuesday. They come out on Wednesday, and, you know, they're linked in the newsletter and everything like that. But, you know, doing projections, rankings, and, you know, one of my favorite things that is, I wouldn't say it's really behind the scenes, but, you know, because Fantasy Life is such a fantasy focused company, we also have the betting game models there, and, you know, there's a lot of research that's gone into them. You know, I manage them. I think they're pretty good, you know. And you know, we take injury information into account. We take a lot of situations into account, like, oh, this team is playing their third out of 4 games at home, you know, like at 3 out of 4 weeks at home. It's like, well, you know, that's not a massive thing, but it's something. And, you know, we account for all of these different factors, and they end up coming to bear in the game model. And so I'm doing the projection work for that, and I think it's a really cool thing. So I would also say people should check that out too.
Yeah, you do it. Obviously, you're a huge part of the betting life aspect of the brand, and obviously, you know, I think a lot of that information can be extrapolated for fantasy consumers as well to apply to, you know, everyday fantasy life, or everyday fantasy playing. From a consumer perspective, just looking at everything that Fantasy Life is doing, what are some of your favorite tools and content that comes out of Fantasy Life?
The utilization report, I think, is the first thing that, you know, anyone would probably mention. I think it is the best pound for pound research tool, especially in season. Now, of course, outside of the season, you can always look back, use the data there, and kind of see trends and project forward. But I think during the season, it really shines because, you know, you can see that a guy, oh, he had 8 targets and, you know, had this production, but, like, okay, how many routes was he on the field? Like, how many snaps did he play? Like, all of the underlying stuff that can kind of help you get a sense as to whether, like, was that 8 targets? Is that number like really sticky, or is that just kind of like a fluke thing? So the utilization report is something I like consult frequently during the year. And then I'll just say, you know, this isn't exactly addressing the question you asked, but like guillotine leagues, I mean, it's now my favorite form of like redraft season long fantasy. So I would also say, and we've got leagues that, you know, you can start it up anytime in the season. So we've got leagues that you can be drafting now and play to the end of the season. So I'd say everyone should be sure to check that out, because I think once you do that, it becomes something that I wouldn't say like you're obsessed with it, right? But, like, I don't know, I become pretty fascinated by it, because you can get like awesome players on waivers in the guillotine leagues, and you don't get that in any other type of setup.
It's true. Yeah. Shout out Dwayne McFarland with the utilization report. And yeah, guillotine. If you haven't played guillotine, it is one of the coolest experiences in fantasy. For me, I just love that sweat. I think the waiver wire, it just hits different. I think that just that week to week grind, it's a special format. Again, it's basically, you know, every manager competes every week. The last place team gets chopped, and then all those players dive into the waiver wire. And so it's a free for all, but there's so much to it when it comes to, you know, strategy. That's where obviously you guys kill it with, you know, with content around the game. guillotineleagues.com. Definitely a special fantasy game. And I love it for like a side league, for a lot of home leagues. Everyone loves their home league. They might be, stuck in the certain format that they roll with, but a guillotine league as a side league with a home league is just absolute perfection.
Yeah, love that.
So obviously you are found on X at Matt F the Oracle. Talk about that origin of that handle. Where did that come from?
So I got into fantasy, I guess at this point, close to 20 years ago. And I wasn't doing any fantasy content, but I was obsessed with it. And then around, I think 2009, 2010, FX had the show called The League, right? Which like is a classic for everyone who is obsessed with fantasy sports. And I thought it was a great show. Well, in the premiere episode, the pilot episode, there's this kid in it who's named Matt Freedman, and he's the Oracle. He's like the kid who like predicted that Jay Cutler in his first game with the Bears would throw like 4 interceptions. And at the time, I was like living in a house with these other guys, and one of them was like, "You need to come watch this." And so the show was awesome, but also it's like they when we got to the point of like, "Oh, that's Matt Freedman, the Oracle, no wife, no kids, pure football genius," right? Like they just all started laughing because it was like that was me, no wife, no kids, obsessed with fantasy football. And so I just kind of had to take the Oracle as like when I got onto Twitter, just had to take it as like a part of the handle.
Yeah, that's absolutely hilarious because, think about yourself at that time,
Yeah.
watching the show, adopting that name a little bit and then projecting forward 20 years
Right.
and looking at where you're at now. It's pretty wild how life works sometimes. But
Yeah.
obviously you're diving into fantasy. I'm sure preceding that was just finding a passion for sports. When did you develop a love for sports?
I mean, love for sports. Since like some of my earliest memories, I remember my first memory of football. I grew up, sadly, still a Cowboys fan, but grew up in the Dallas Fort Worth area. And I remember going to a football game with my family and some family friends. And it was December of, I might get some of the information wrong, but I believe it was December of 1988. The Cowboys absolutely sucked. I think they won only one game that year, but it was against Washington. And that was the year Washington won the Super Bowl. And I just remember everyone like cheering like at like a few key moments in that game, just like 70,000 people all cheering as a guy runs for a touchdown. And I'm like a 5-year-old kid and just thinking like, this is amazing. And then of course the Cowboys went on that run of winning 3 Super Bowls, and you just think like it's going to be like this for the rest of my life, but like that was sort of the early days of really being into like all of the Dallas sports teams, right? And so it's just, I think I've been, there, of course it hasn't been great to be a Cowboys fan for the past 30 years, but you have the Mavericks winning a championship, you have the Dallas Stars winning a championship back in the day, you have the Rangers winning a World Series a couple of years ago, kind of out of nowhere, and like all of those teams I've been really into since I was a little kid.
I love it. It's a cool time to kind of dive into it's a trap, obviously, with the Cowboys, but cool to experience that as a child, right? To see
Yeah.
the terrible team, and then you get Troy Aikman, Emmett comes along, Michael Irvin, and you get to experience that ride. I mean, that's pretty special. I do have to ask, any Dallas fan who kind of enjoyed that era. I'm a Barry Sanders guy. What's your thoughts on the whole Emmett Barry thing? Like back in the day, I'm sure there was a little bias, but objectively, Barry Emmett, what are your thoughts on that topic?
I mean, look, I would never ever say anything to besmirch the integrity of Emmitt Smith, but I will say Barry Sanders was one of a kind. Like Barry, he was basically doing it on his own in that Detroit offense. Barry was amazing.
I love the answer, and true respect to Emmett. Like, is there ever been a just a battle tested grinder like him? The amount of
Yeah.
carries and seasons he put in, he was tough. He was tough, and he deserved all the accolades he got. But yeah, Barry was pretty darn special. So when it comes to those those memories, early memories, or even recent ones, like what's your what's the worst loss you ever experienced as a sports fan?
I mean, the worst loss, I don't, I mean, look, this is not the correct answer, but I would say like the worst loss is like, it's the off the field stuff, like
Mhm.
trading Luka Doncic. That's not like a single game loss, but that's like a lifelong loss.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of thing that like every day, like I would be wearing my Mavericks hat. I literally have not worn that Mavericks hat since they traded Luka Doncic. Like that was, I mean, I know it sounds stupid to say like that was maybe one of like the worst 5 days of my life, but like that was a terrible day to go from less than a year ago, this team was in the NBA finals. And you
Yeah.
think we have, a top 5, maybe top 3 NBA player. As long as we have him, we always have a shot to compete for a championship. And it's like you had the literal passing of the torch from Dirk to Luka when that one season that they were together on the court. Like I specifically went to a game that year just because I wanted to see that. I wanted to
Yeah.
see, even though it was Luka's first year, you just had a sense, even then, of greatness. I wanted to see Dirk and Luka on the court together. And it's like now, Mavericks fans, they were just robbed of that. We were robbed of potentially like 10 to 15 years of greatness. And so, like, I know that's not like an on the court or on the field loss, but it's like the stuff that happens in my head, like the stuff that happens off of the court, off of the field, that determines what happens on game day. And like, I felt like we were robbed of like 1,000 games of Luka.
Yeah, that's a great answer because I think about I was at the Super Bowl when Russ threw that interception and we
Mm,
lost to the Patriots.
yeah.
We had won the previous year. It's all good, but that was devastating. But losing the Sonics as a sports fan in an area, it kind of
Yeah.
reminds me of losing a player. Seeing Griffey leave, but like losing the Sonics, having the team just stolen from us, that
Yeah.
hurts. So I like what you're saying. It's not always a specific game that breaks your heart, but it can be something bigger than that. You put a lot of time and effort into fandom, for a certain player, and all of a sudden it's gone. So I hear you on that one. So what's your favorite all time sports moment?
I mean, I think it has to be the 52-17 Super Bowl win over the Bills, like, because that was the first one for the Cowboys in that run in the 90s.
Yeah.
And, the Cowboys, it's not like I really understood the concept of betting at that point, but, you're watching the pregame show and everyone's picking the Bills to win. It's like the Cowboys are underdogs, that people aren't expecting them to win the game. You don't know how big of underdogs they are until, like you start looking at the historical data later and you're like, oh, I mean, they were expected to get killed in that game, and like, hey, just a few years ago, they were the worst team in the league,
Yeah.
and so to go from that to, wow, like not only did we just win the Super Bowl, but this game was basically over at halftime. And then they continued to pile it on. Like that to me just felt like this, like the greatest sports memory. And it's like, it still feels good thinking about it and reading about it and watching shows about it years later. Like it still feels amazing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I remember that matchup for sure. I mean, as a kid in Seattle, like wasn't a lot to root for the Seahawks, so I definitely was a bandwagon kid looking at his teams. I love both the squads because they were so
Yeah.
similar. You got Kelly and Aikman, you got Andre Reed, Michael Irvin, you got Emmett and Thurman, like, and
Yeah.
got defenders on both sides. That very similar teams. You think it's gonna be an epic matchup, and Dallas just absolutely destroyed them. So yeah, that's a good one for sure. Now you obviously you mentioned falling falling into the fantasy trap 20 years ago or whatnot. What was it that hooked you about the game? What was it that struck you about fantasy football that made you think I got to come back for this?
Well, I mean, always liked sports. And then it was a way of kind of participating in sports, and like, and I'm always like, I wouldn't say like I'm a super cerebral guy, but like, I like puzzles. I like kind of logical puzzles. I like thinking about games. And so this is a way of kind of gamifying the passion that I have for sports and, the knowledge that I might have for sports. And so, and it's got that social component where you can do it with friends and you can compete against friends and let them know that you are better than them. Right. So it's all of these things put together that just like originally kind of pulled me into it. And I will say, like, so when I was in high school, I knew that some friends of mine were in a fantasy league, a long time fantasy league with like their dads. And like that seemed like kind of a cool thing. And then when I was in college, some of my buddies were in a league, but I never like really got into it until my final year in college. The crazy thing about this is that it wasn't a league that I was in. It was a league that my girlfriend at the time was in. It was like the girls league and she needed help with the draft. So basically it was like the girls league. And then all of these teams were being shadow managed by the boyfriends.
I love
And
it.
so like the boyfriends would be like talking trash to each other about like the teams that aren't even theirs in a league that they're technically not in. Right. That was like my first foray into fantasy. And then so the next year it was like, okay, I need to actually get in a real league. And so that was when I got like back together with high school buddies and we did a draft. And that same league doesn't exist, but basically the spinoff, the dynasty spinoff from that league is still going almost like, 16, 17 years later.
That's hilarious. I can just picture, you're having a casual conversation with one of the other boyfriends, and you guys know each other's rosters or the
Yeah.
girlfriend's rosters.
Right.
Like, hey, who's running this team? I love
Right.
it. So okay, so you've been playing for obviously a long time. You do a lot of stuff, obviously with the betting, DFS, all kind of stuff. Like with fantasy leagues, how many are you in these days?
Honestly,
This season?
I have really tried to cull down. And so, they're like the kind of like the industry leagues that, that people do. But in terms of like personal leagues, I'm in two.
Nice.
At, maybe three. Like, so, a company league that sort of like straddles the line between industry and friends and
Yeah.
family, in the dynasty league, the longtime dynasty league with the buddies from high school. And then I'm in a guillotine league with some buddies and some, subscribers to Fantasy Life. So those are the ones that I'm in. And I really try not to do any other leagues because I just don't want to divert my attention away from the leagues that I care about and then away from the content that I'm trying to do during the week.
Yeah, I know, it totally makes sense. Now, in the past, playing in some of these home type leagues, any fun traditions that you've witnessed that just kind of, I guess, bring out that fantasy life kind of vibe, the kind of stuff that would be celebrated by Matthew Berry?
Yeah, I mean, we've toyed around in the Dynasty League with having, like the losers punishment. And there was one year where someone had to like run around in like a nudie uniform, like a nudie outfit, but they
Nice.
never actually did it. And
Ah,
so, and it's like, like who's really going to enforce it? It's like at this point, we're all like in our 30s and our 40s. And it's like, man, he just literally did not have time to do it because he's got 3 kids, it's just like, that we have ideas, but then sometimes the ideas don't get executed.
that is something that a lot of leagues can relate to for sure.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've played in a lot of leagues in your time. Who's the biggest rival you've ever played with? Like, who's the one person you think of when you think of a fantasy football rival?
I mean, I would say so I had a really good team in Dynasty early on in the league, but I didn't win until like the 5th year of the league. And I was in the like a killer division. And so I would say like the guys in that division, like they all won championships before I did, even though I probably had like the best team sort of in the totality over that time period. And so like all of those guys, like we're still in that same division. And it's just like, the first 3 weeks of the season, I play those 3 guys,
Nice.
and it's like I have a sense of how my season is going to go based on how the first 3 weeks of the season go. Let me tell you something. I am 0-3 right now in that dynasty league. I have lost in total by like 5 points across those games. Like it's just like literally that first week, I lost by like two tenths of a point. Right. It's just like I've run back. And the thing is, it's not like I have an old team at this point. It's like Patrick Mahomes is my quarterback. That was great 5 years ago. It doesn't feel so great now. So it's like there are these things to where it's like those guys are my rivals
Yeah.
and they all just barely beat me 3 weeks in a row. And it feels terrible. At the same time, I'm like, you know what? Screw it. Let's go get that number one pick.
Yeah, I love it. No, obviously, that kind of says something about divisions. I'm going to ask you about
Yeah.
settings and formats, that you might like in fantasy. But a lot of people don't realize that like divisions can add an element to a fantasy league that, again, you know, inspire rivalries and add a little, different element to the game. But yeah, league settings, formats. What do you enjoy the most in fantasy?
I really like the head-to-head best ball aspect.
Okay.
So, and that's what we have in that dynasty league where it started out as head-to-head, but I like the best ball component because it keeps the matchups live all the way through through Sunday into Monday.
Yeah.
You still do waivers the same that you would do in a normal league, but like there was a point 10 years ago where it's like guys had kids, they had other stuff that they were focused on Sunday mornings. And it's like, hey, you forgot to set your lineup. And so like the best ball component just sort of like eradicated the need for like all of the in-week research of who am I starting, who am I sitting. It eradicated oh man, it's like 12:55 and I need to go set my lineup and this guy just got scratched. It eradicated that. And it meant that like all of the games you had more of a sweat in because it's Monday night. And even though like in a normal situation, this one guy would have been on your bench, now what he does in this game actually matters. But it's not like strictly best ball. You still have that head-to-head component where you're playing against a guy and what you get for your score actually matters in that head-to-head matchup. So I do like the head-to-head best ball component. I like it's for me, like I think it is the funnest of the different like scoring types. I guess it's not a scoring type, but like the format types
Yeah.
that you could have.
That's cool. Yeah, I think that a lot of people could glean something from that. In that, you're right. I think a lot of naysayers would say, okay, you're losing that element of setting your lineups. Like it's a huge part of fantasy. But I like what you said that it makes all those games relevant to the very end. It's good for people that are busy, but it's also good for people that just want to live on the edge. So it reminds me of kind of like a guillotine thing where like that Monday night, anything can go down.
Yeah.
And so that's a cool way to look at it. I like that.
Yeah, it's a
So
trade-off. It's a trade-off.
yeah,
There like when we switched to that format, there were a couple of guys, and there's still some guys. Of course, these are just the guys who are going to grumble about anything.
yeah,
But there are still some guys who are like, look, I just kind of like having to do the research of figuring out who I'm starting, who I'm sitting.
that's
Yeah,
great. No, I love
yeah,
it.
it's a
So
trade-off.
so yeah, for sure. Now playing fantasy, like, did you have an all-time favorite moment playing the game?
There was, you know, I will probably screw up some details, but I do remember. So two things. One, the time I won that first dynasty championship, and Michael Crabtree was one of my wide receivers, and he scored 2 touchdowns in a game. And I think one of them was like on a trick field goal, and that just like that felt good because it was just like that's like a freak thing, and like
Yeah.
I absolutely clobbered in that matchup. But that was just like it was like piling on, and the Crabtree touchdown it was just like out of nowhere and totally unnecessary. That felt great. And I think in another like playoff scenario, I like randomly picked up the Bucks defense. And then that week, I think they had like 2 special teams touchdowns or like a return touchdown. And like I had gone to the gym or whatever. I wasn't really like paying attention. And then I looked and they had like 30 points. And it was just like, there's no way I'm losing this matchup this week. And like just like that little moment of luck of like picking up this defense, putting them in and then them carrying me in that all important playoff week. Like that was awesome.
I love it. So, what ended up inspiring you to get into content creation? What was the inspiration behind that, and when was that?
It was basically like I couldn't help myself. I basically just had to. Like I was so obsessed with fantasy and like researching stuff that if it didn't turn into like a quote unquote career or at least like a creative outlet, I don't know like what I would have ended up doing with my life. But I was in grad school. I was supposed to be researching for a dissertation. I was in a PhD program in English, but I was basically just like researching like fantasy football stuff all the time. And so Rotoviz, the site had just started, and there were a number of writers there that I liked, and they put out a call for contributors, and it was 2013, and I had like ideas, and it was like, look, like I'm a decent writer because, you know, of like the being in the graduate program in English, like editing, stuff like that. That's just like kind of professionally in my lane. And I like researching, like I like thinking about, you know, numbers and trying to project, you know, guys from college to the NFL and all that stuff. So I sent at the time Frank DuPont, aka Fantasy Douche. I sent him the thoughts that I had. One of them was on T.Y. Hilton, and he was like, turn that into an article. And I did, and you know that article was like, I don't know, 4,000 words. I've learned how to be. I mean, all appearances to the contrary in this podcast, but I've learned how to be a little bit faster, a little bit tighter with my language. But I mean, that was like a massive article that he was just like, we got to split this in two parts. But it was basically like, hey, T.Y. Hilton, I think he's going to be pretty good in the NFL. And that was the first piece. You know, it worked out, and it just kind of went from there. And so, you know, I along with John Moore started the Rotoviz podcast back in the day, you know, which is, you know, still going strong. And then you know, started writing for more sites, wrote for PFF, wrote for, you know, Fantasy Insiders. And then I was lucky enough that in 2015, that turned into an offer for a full-time job with Fantasy Labs late in 2015, which was, you know, just starting right then. So I think it was like January 2016 was my first month of being full-time in the industry. So it, you know, it was grinding pretty hard for about 2.5 years before that happened.
So fast forward to, you know, obviously your opportunity at Fantasy Life. How did that present?
Well, I had worked with a number of people at the company previously at other places. You know, I knew Elliot Christ, the CEO. I had, you know, had some exchanges with Matthew Berry. I knew Pete Overzet, who you know, was one of the creative leads there, and who, you know, for years was like, he was like the guy writing the newsletter every day. I'd known him from the Rotoviz days. Dwayne McFarland, he and I actually grew up in the same hometown
No
in
way.
Texas. Yeah. And like we kind of didn't know that until we met in Canton a few years ago. And I knew he was from Texas, and I knew he was a Cowboys fan. I thought he was from the DFW area. So I was like, hey, where exactly are you from? And he said Burleson. And I was like, man, I grew up in Burleson. Like my parents still live in Burleson, you know? So like there were just like a number of connections. And Ian, I'd worked with Ian previously at Fantasy Labs and Action Network. And so I just kind of had a connection with a number of people who worked there. And so when the, you know, opportunity arose to join the team, it just seemed like something that I'd really enjoy.
What's been the most rewarding part of this journey for you?
Uh, you know, just the people, the people, you know, I think it's a small space. And of course, it's, you know, it's a competitive space in that, you know, there are only so many people who play fantasy. There are only so many hours in the day. And so, you know, they can't read everything. You want them to read your stuff or listen to your podcast, but it's a really friendly space. Even though it's a competitive space, it's a friendly space and still a collaborative space. And so, you know, the friendships that I've formed with people, you know, along the way, you know, 10 years now being full time in the industry, the friendships I think are really special.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible community for sure. We're going to touch on that in a second. But when it comes to content, what is your favorite type to create? I mean, obviously, you do a lot with, you know, fantasy, dynasty, NFL draft. Obviously, you've done a ton with the NFL draft, which I love that kind of stuff. Growing up
Yeah.
as a kid, I mean, you know, the NFL draft was like a holiday to me. And obviously, sports betting, you know, huge. You're doing a lot of stuff with that. So, what kind of content do you like to create the most?
Man, it's probably NFL draft, because that was like one of the things, like even with how I kind of got started in fantasy, I was thinking about, college guys going to the NFL. And, outside of that, I was just still obsessed, with mock drafts and thinking about, like which offensive lineman this team might take and stuff like that. So, even before fantasy, for me, it was the NFL draft. And I'm like you, like the Super Bowl is great. I kind of prefer the NFL draft. I know that sounds so wild, but it's like, there are only two teams in the Super
Yeah.
Bowl. The
Yeah.
NFL draft, and this is kind of what I said, like what happens off the field determines what happens on the field. Like
Yeah.
the NFL draft, that sets up your franchise or sets back your franchise for the next 5 years. Like all of those decisions matter. And every team has something that they're trying to accomplish in the draft. And like that's one of the few moments, like free agency and the NFL draft. That's one of the few moments to where it's like, okay, you can say whatever you want, but what you actually do in this moment, how you allocate your resources, that is really what matters. Like that determines the trajectory of your franchise and what kind of team you're going to be. So I really like those moments where it's like the coach speak, the GM speak, the owner speak. It doesn't matter. Like they're putting their cards on the table. And so I really like the NFL draft, and it's a puzzle. I like trying to predict it, to do mock drafts with it, and think about, all right, well, I know this guy went number 3 overall, but really he shouldn't have gone that high. I don't think he's going to have as good of an NFL career. So there are like all of these little components of the NFL draft that I find really fascinating.
Well, and on the the fan side of things, I mean, everyone has hope, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone has hope for what their team's doing. I mean, there can be obviously opinions. Some fan bases hate what their teams are doing, but it's exciting. It's a fun time of year. Everyone's involved. Definitely a special part of the NFL calendar
Yeah.
for sure. And you've had a ton of success with mock drafting and predictions with draft. Is that correct?
Yeah. I would say I'm just so obsessed with it that, I've been doing mocks. Even when I wasn't like publishing mocks, I was basically like doing mocks, still like mapping stuff out and doing mocks for years. So there are different mock draft competitions. And I think maybe 2018, 2019, thereabouts, I started, submitting my mock drafts to competitions. And, it was a little bit of a learning curve, because they're like, it's a game, it's just like fantasy football is a game. It's not like just sort of like predicting what happens. It's like trying to think about, okay, within this competition, here are some of the nuances that can maybe get me an extra point or two or something like that. But, just kind of learning how to do mock drafts and looking at what other people do, doing a lot of research, seeing what the beat reporters are saying, all of those things. So, yeah, I've been fortunate. I think since 2020, I've been the number one mock drafter in one of these competitions. And the thing is, I haven't won the competition, but I've been like top 5 multiple times. And so like over the stretch run, it's been good. But man, I would like to take down one of these competitions one of these years.
Well, that'd be fun. But yeah, consistency matters probably more than anything, right? Each and every year coming back and delivering the goods is probably what consumers want from the analysts they follow. So I love that. Now, obviously, again, you've had this journey in fantasy sports. You've seized opportunities. Talk to the people out there that want to get more involved in fantasy content creation, or people that have been maybe doing it but want to level up. What's your advice for people that want to get more involved in fantasy content?
Yeah. I mean, a few thoughts. So one is that, in the early RotoViz days, there were a lot of really smart people there. Rich Rebar was there. Davis Maddock was there. You had Pete Overzet. Like you just kind of look, and it, like, I don't want to say everyone in the industry started at RotoViz, but like that you can find at a lot of places like one person who started at RotoViz. And I would say the difference between the guys who ended up going from RotoViz to getting full-time jobs and the guys who didn't, I don't think it really had anything to do with intelligence. I think it had to do with just like sticking with it, like perseverance and hard work. Like that counts for a lot, you know and so I don't think you need to be like the most like talented, like whether you're sort of like on the mic or like analytical or whatever it is. I don't think you need to be the most talented. Like you just need to be consistent and like be willing to work hard. And then I would say there are a couple other components. One would be, can you do something that is different than what people can find elsewhere? Like, can you distinguish yourself in some way? Whether that's, so I would say like someone like Matt Harmon, who has like the angle of really diving into what wide receivers are doing and getting granular with it, right there, or like what Dwayne does with the utilization report. Like, can you think of a specific angle, but an area where you can talk about something in a way that no one else is talking about it? I think that is something that is useful and could help you kind of like fast track, right, the ability to gain an audience. And then one final thing, I would say like humor helps. I don't think it's necessary, and it's not like you even need to be really like humorous with your content, but like life is tough. Like being in the industry can be tough. If you can have a sense of humor about it, and like I think that kind of helps you persevere. It helps you stick with it, and I think a good sense of humor can also, like, it can just humanize you a little bit, right? It can make it maybe a little bit easier for people in your audience to connect with you, not because like you're so funny, but they can feel that like there's something good about you, right? So I think a good sense of humor helps. And then this is, I'd say, connected, but like, don't be a jerk. I mean, like I can't say I'm perfect, like there are probably times when I'm a little bit jerky, but like I think in general, the people who stick a long time in the industry, part of it is that they're fairly easy to work with. Like they don't make it hard to work with them, which means that it's just easier for them to stick around. So those would be my big picture thoughts.
Yeah, all of that is great advice. And earlier you mentioned community and how, the industry, the community has impacted you in networking, a huge part of
Mhm.
it, getting, meeting people, obviously you want to get connected in this space. If you want to do things in this space, you want to establish some relationships. You attended the expo a few years ago. How was that experience for you?
I mean, I loved it. That's, where I met Dwayne for the first time. It's where, like, even if I had known some people, it was where I got to meet them in person for the first time. So, that's always a great experience. I didn't go the past 2 years. And, some of that was just sort of like the timing of various things, to where it didn't work out, but I definitely missed it. And I definitely had, some friends send me photos being like, "Hey, you're not here at George's with us."
Yeah.
It's, man, it would have been fun. Yeah. But I definitely enjoyed that. And I hope to go back to it at some point in the future.
I love it. Well, at this time, what are you most grateful for? And then, obviously name a few of the people that have had a big impact on you during your journey.
I mean, I'm just grateful to be full-time in the industry, like it's funny because I feel like there's not this trend as much anymore, but a few years ago, I think there was a trend among some people who were full timers who were like, "Oh, the season's almost here. I'm sort of dreading it." And then you had a lot of people who weren't full time in the industry being like, "Man, I would like commit unspeakable crimes to have the job that you have." And so, like, for me, I'm just grateful. Like, it's a job that requires lots of hours, but I love it. Like, if I weren't doing this full time for my job, I would just be doing this on the side because it's like I'm interested in all of this stuff anyway. So to have the ability to do it full time is just a total gift. And so, obviously super thankful, to Matthew Berry, who owns the company, to Elliot Chris, the CEO, Dan Kaufman, who's our chief strategy officer, and then, to people who helped along the way. Fantasy Douche, who, I actually met in person for the first time a few years ago, but, who, like, I guess at this point, like 13 years ago, 12 years ago, gave me that first opportunity to write an article about T.Y. Hilton, who had the idea for creating the podcast, and so there are a number of people like that, a number of sort of like quote unquote like administrators or something like that who, were willing to work with me. Jonathan Bales and Peter Jennings, who started Fantasy Labs and gave me my first full-time job. always will be immensely grateful for that. Chad Millman, who was the content officer at Action Network for years, tremendously grateful for the guidance and the flexibility that he gave me in my career. So yeah, a number of people to be thankful for. But like, what am I most thankful for? Just that, like, I get to do this for a living. It's an unreal thing.
I love it. Well, this has been a ton of fun. Thank you so much for joining me, Matt. Can you share with the listeners and viewers where they can find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on social at Matt F the Oracle, and all of the work is at Fantasy Life. I have Freeman's favorites. I have the projections. I have the articles. I have a bold predictions piece that comes out each week where I try to be as this might sound weird. I try to be wrong. Like I try, because it's not bold if you're like hitting 100% of your predictions, you know what I mean? So like, it's like, I'm intentionally trying to say stuff that is like unlikely to happen, but I at least want to be directionally correct. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I have the bold predictions piece, but yeah, really just the projections, the rankings, the content. I'm on some podcasts towards the end of the week. And this week I'm on Talk Data to Me with Dwayne McFarland. It's all of the content at Fantasy Life. I think it's great. And I'm all over it. So check it out.
Awesome. Loved having you on here, my man. And best of luck moving forward.
Thanks. Same to you.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast. Until next time, be sure to follow and subscribe to all of FFU's social media accounts for daily content.